Imagine a city so rich its people didn't just survive, they had so much money they lost their minds. 4,000 years ago, Sodom sat in the Jordan Valley as a wealthy superpower. Oil bubbled like liquid gold, the fields were green like Eden, high walls controlled trade routes, and markets overflowed with silver. The people inside had never known hunger, war, or fear, and in one single morning, God burned it all to ash. Most people think Sodom was destroyed just for sexual sin, but they are completely wrong. Sexual sin was not the main reason God destroyed the land. It was only the final boiling point. In Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 49, God listed 5 sins that rotted this city. And the first sin? Almost everyone watching this is guilty of it today. These are the 5 great sins of Sodom, and why God had no choice but to burn them to ashes. Let us begin. Number 1. Pride. Ezekiel 16:49. Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant. The Hebrew word Ezekiel uses here is ga'an. It does not mean simple confidence. It means majestic, swelling arrogance, the deep, reflexive contempt that grows in people who have never faced genuine difficulty. It is the kind of pride that makes a person look at a hungry stranger standing at the gate and think, that problem is not mine. Not confidence. Contempt. Imagine the elders of Sodom in the cool of the evening. They gather on the flat rooftops of their stone houses overlooking the plain, goblets of wine in their hands, surveying the green valley stretching toward the horizon as if they had planted every seed themselves. Copper-armored guards stand on top of towering mud brick walls, looking down at desert nomads passing below like ants. A merchant adjusts the rings on his fingers, while a servant fans him with a palm leaf. A group of young men lean against the gate pillars, laughing at a shepherd who has come to sell wool, offering him half what it is worth because they can. Because who is this outsider to argue with the men of Sodom? This is not a city that gives thanks. This is a city that gives orders. When blessing arrives without effort, the human heart has 2 options: gratitude or ownership. Sodom chose ownership. They looked at the fertile valley, the bitumen flowing from the ground, the caravans pouring silver through their gates, and they said, "We built this. We earned this. This is ours." The architecture itself tells the story. Archaeological evidence at Tal el-Hammam reveals houses with elaborate inward-facing courtyards, high walls separating properties from one another, rooms designed to impress visitors with the owner's wealth. A city built to display status, not to welcome outsiders. And here is the modern parallel that most of us will not want to hear. How many of us have looked at what we have and said the exact same thing? I built this, I earned this, no one gave me anything. The refusal to acknowledge that every breath, every harvest, every opportunity, every morning you woke up alive came from somewhere above you. We carry our accomplishments like trophies and treat our blessings like paychecks we deposited ourselves. When was the last time you thanked God for something you told everyone else you earned on your own? They had everything God had given them, and they credited themselves, and Sodom still had everything. That was the problem. Because once a people believe their wealth is self-made, the next step is inevitable. They begin to consume it without limit. And Ezekiel named this second. That was the first step down. There are 4 more. Number 2. Excess of food. Ezekiel 16:49. They had excess of food. The Hebrew phrase is sivat lehem. Fullness of bread to the point of surfeit, not merely having enough, but having so much that the act of eating lost its gratitude and became a dull, mechanical excess. Imagine the banqueting halls of Sodom as the sun begins to set. Long cedar tables draped in linen cloth, the wood stained dark from years of spilled wine. Whole lambs turning over open flames, the fat dripping into the coals with a hiss that fills the courtyard with thick, sweet smoke. Bowls of imported spices from the eastern trade routes, saffron and cumin and coriander ground fresh and dusted over flatbread, still warm from the stone oven. Pomegranates split open and dripping crimson juice onto polished stone platters. Dates stuffed with crushed almonds arranged in towers on bronze serving trays. Wine poured until it overflows the cup and runs down the side, pooling on the table, and no one moves to wipe it because there is always more. And at the end of every night, the servants sweep the uneaten meat off the tables onto the floor. Whole loaves of bread, untouched, are tossed into the street. The dogs circle the doorways waiting, because the dogs of Sodom have learned that more food is thrown away in this city every evening than most families in the surrounding desert eat in a week. The dogs grew fat in Sodom. The poor grew thin. Archaeological excavations reveal enormous underground silos carved directly into rock, storage chambers with sophisticated ventilation systems and capacity to hold grain reserves far exceeding what the population required. Surplus beyond need, hoarded beyond reason. Grain rotting in the dark while people outside the walls went without. When food has been guaranteed for generations, something changes in the collective psychology. Waste becomes ritual. Throwing food away becomes a display of power. Banquets that serve no purpose beyond demonstrating wealth become daily routine. Eating is no longer nourishment, it is performance. And the more you waste, the more powerful you appear. And here is the modern parallel. You have food in your kitchen right now that people in other parts of the world would weep over. When was the last time you threw food away? You know the answer. It was this week, maybe today. You scraped something off a plate into the bin without thinking about it, and somewhere on this earth, right now, a mother is watching her child fall asleep hungry and praying that tomorrow will be different. You did not cause her pain, but you did not feel it either. The fire was already burning in the waste on the banqueting tables, in the grain rotting in silos because no one noticed and no one cared. And somewhere outside the city walls, a family that had been walking for days smelled the roasting meat on the wind and quickened their pace toward the gates. They did not know that charity had become an inconvenience inside those walls. Excess does not simply waste resources, it wastes something far more dangerous. It wastes the human capacity to feel, and when an entire city stops feeling, Ezekiel had a name for what follows. That was the second step down. 3 remain. My scissors. I'm going to talk a show we have power walking along. Number 3. Prosperous ease. Ezekiel 16:49. And prosperous ease. The Hebrew is shalvat hashket. Quiet, undisturbed ease. Careless security. The dangerous peace of a soul that has forgotten trouble exists. This is not laziness. This is numbness. Imagine the interior courtyards of the wealthiest homes in Sodom in the dead heat of the afternoon. High mud brick walls block every sound from the street outside. A shallow pool of cool water sits in the center of the courtyard, fed by a clay pipe from the irrigation channel. A woman reclines on silk cushions in the shade of a linen canopy, her fingers trailing the surface of the water. The slow drift of a harp melody comes from somewhere deeper in the house, a servant playing to fill the silence. Incense burns in a bronze dish on a stone ledge, the smoke curling up in thin blue ribbons and disappearing into the still air. Nothing needs to be done. Nothing has needed to be done for as long as anyone can remember. The fields produce on their own. The bitumen flows on its own. The money arrives on its own. There is no enemy at the wall. There is no drought in the forecast. There is no question about tomorrow, because tomorrow will be exactly like today, and the day after that, and the day after that. This is the most dangerous stage, not because anything dramatic happens, but because nothing does. The soul goes to sleep, and a sleeping conscience cannot hear the cry at the gate. In nearly every ancient culture, survival demanded daily labor. Shepherds tended flocks, farmers planted grain, craftsmen produced tools, but in Sodom, the automatic wealth pouring from the bitumen pits and salt trade created an entire class of people who did nothing productive. When there is no purpose in daily life, when there are no challenges to overcome, and no problems that demand attention, boredom becomes a destructive force. People with infinite time and unlimited money begin seeking increasingly extreme forms of stimulation to fill the void that comfort has carved into their souls. And here is the modern parallel that will land closer to home than most of us are comfortable with. We have built an entire civilization around the elimination of discomfort, and we call it progress. Every inconvenience has an app. Every silence has a screen. Every moment of stillness has a notification waiting to fill it. How many hours did you spend this week being entertained? And how many minutes did you spend in prayer? You know the answer to that too. Somewhere in the city, a child was playing in a courtyard. Somewhere, a woman was pouring wine. The afternoon was quiet, and not one person in the entire plain had noticed that they had stopped praying. No famine came, no army threatened, and no one prayed. A city that stops feeling will inevitably stop caring. And when an entire civilization stops caring about the vulnerable, Ezekiel says something broke that could not be repaired. The third step down. And here the silence begins. Number 4. Neglect of the poor and needy. Ezekiel 16:49. She did not strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. Translated directly from the Hebrew, this means they possessed the resources to help and deliberately chose not to. The negated verb is hazak, to grasp, to hold, to strengthen. They had the means to grab the outstretched hand, and they pulled away. This is the sin that turned Sodom from indulgent to evil. The first 3 sins were passive: pride, excess, apathy. They did not require action, they only required silence. But this 4th sin required a decision. The poor arrived at the gate, and the city chose to turn them away. In the ancient Near East, hospitality was not courtesy, it was survival law. The Code of Hammurabi, contemporary to the time of Abraham, established specific legal protections for strangers and travelers. Sodom reversed this ancient law. Helping the poor became weakness. The display of wealth became the only social priority. When everyone competes to show who has more, giving something to someone who cannot give back breaks the entire logic of status. Imagine the heavy timber gates of Sodom in the late afternoon. The shadow of the wall stretches across the road like a dark hand. A dust-covered traveler appears on the road from the east. He has been walking for 14 days across open desert. His lips are cracked so deep they bleed when he speaks. His sandals are worn through to skin. He reaches the gate and lowers himself to his knees. He reaches out a trembling hand and asks for water. A woman clad in clean, dyed linen steps around him, pulling her robe away so as not to be touched. A merchant glances down, then continues his conversation about grain prices without breaking stride. A child points at the stranger, and a parent pulls the child's hand down and quickens their pace. The traveler asks for bread. He is given none. Not because there was no bread. There was more bread in Sodom than the city could eat, because there was a system. Later Jewish traditions preserved in the Talmud describe a judicial system in Sodom where giving charity was punishable, and judges confiscated the goods of citizens caught helping those in need. Whether these traditions are historically precise is debated, but they align perfectly with the portrait Ezekiel paints. A society that did not merely ignore the poor, but criminalized the act of helping them. And here is the modern parallel that will not let you go. There is someone in your life right now who is quietly falling apart. You have seen the signs, the canceled plans, the shorter replies, the look in their eyes that says something is wrong but their mouth says they are fine. You noticed, and you kept scrolling, you kept moving, you had things to do. That is not cruelty. You are not a monster, but it is the exact same arithmetic that ran Sodom. I have enough. They do not, and that is not my problem. Sodom still had everything except mercy. The fire did not start from the sky. It started at the city gate when a hand reached out and no one took it. The hand was still reaching and the gate closed. When a civilization criminalizes compassion, when the vulnerable become invisible, when human life itself loses its sacred weight, there is only one place left to fall. And what happened on Sodom's last night was not the cause of God's judgment. It was the proof that there was nothing left to save. The fourth step down. This is where God's patience cracked. Number 5. sexual immorality. The fifth sin was sexual immorality. The Bible states this clearly, and we are not going to skip it. Ezekiel 16:50. They were haughty and committed abomination before me. Jude 1:7. Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding towns gave themselves up to sexual immorality and perversion. They serve as an example of those who suffer the punishment of eternal fire. The Hebrew word in Ezekiel is tueva, a violation of the sacred created order. In this context, it refers to sexual acts that invert God's design for human intimacy. Jude specifies the nature, the pursuit of unnatural desire and predatory sexual violence. This was not a random explosion of evil. This was the destination. Pride produced excess. Excess produced numbness. Numbness produced coldness. Coldness erased the value of human life. And when human life lost its sacred weight, the body became an object, something to use, something to consume, something to discard. The men who surrounded Lot's house on that final night were not born predators. They were made by a system that had spent generations teaching them that nothing was sacred and no one outside their walls mattered. Genesis 19:5 records their demand. Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them. The demand was sexual. The intent was violent. The target was the most vulnerable people in the city, strangers with no protector, no advocate, no one to speak on their behalf. Most people think this was the only sin of Sodom. It was not. But it was a sin. Jude names it, Genesis records it, and Ezekiel places it at the bottom of a 5-step chain, the final stage of a moral collapse that began with something as quiet as pride. Sexual sin was the eruption, but the disease had been growing for generations underneath it. A culture that treats the human body as a commodity instead of a creation, that separates intimacy from covenant, that consumes people the way Sodom consumed food, is walking a road that has been walked before. And the Bible recorded where it ends. 5 sins, 1 chain, and the bottom was not where anyone expected the fall to begin. The 5th step, the bottom. And it was on one night, one single night, that all 5 sins erupted at the same time on the same street in front of the same door. And 2 angels saw enough to close the case. The 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of the city. In the ancient world, the gate was not just an entrance. It was a courthouse, a marketplace, a seat of governance. Lot had a position in this city. He was not hiding in Sodom. He was integrated. When Lot sees the 2 strangers, his reaction reveals everything about the city he lives in. He does not casually invite them to dinner. He bows with his face to the ground. He presses them to come to his house. When they say they will spend the night in the town square, Lot presses harder. His urgency is not politeness, it is fear. He knows what happens to strangers who spend the night in the open in this city. He has seen it before. They reach his house. Lot prepares bread. The door closes. For a brief moment, there is warmth, lamplight on the mud brick walls, bread on the table, the last peaceful hour inside Sodom. Then comes the sound, Genesis 19:4. Before they had gone to bed, all the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. Read that again. All the men from every part of the city, both young and old. Not a mob, not a radical faction. Not a fringe group emboldened by darkness, the entire male population. The text is explicit. Every generation, every neighborhood, every household. They came together with one purpose. The crowd turns on Lot. Stand back. This fellow came here as a foreigner, and now he wants to play the judge. We will treat you worse than them. They surge forward. The door is about to give. The angels reach through the doorway, pull Lot inside, and slam the door shut. Then they strike every man standing outside with blindness, young and old, from the nearest to the farthest. Darkness falls on the entire crowd in an instant, and here is the detail that reveals the absolute depth of what Sodom had become. After being struck blind, unable to see their own hands in front of their faces, the men of Sodom did not stop. They did not scatter. They did not cry out in fear or confusion. Genesis 19:11 says they wearied themselves trying to find the door. They kept groping. Blinded by the power of God in total darkness, they still tried to force their way inside. They could not see, and they still did not stop. That single verse is the diagnosis. That is a city beyond any human intervention, beyond warning, beyond patience, beyond mercy that offers another chance. The angels turned to Lot. "Get everyone you have out of this city. We are about to destroy this place." Lot runs through the dark streets to warn the men engaged to his daughters. He tells them what is coming. Genesis 19:14. But his sons-in-law thought he was joking. Two men heard the truth from a man who had heard it from angels, who had heard it from the mouth of God. And they laughed. They went back to sleep. And by morning, they were dead. As morning dawns, the angels urge Lot to leave. But he lingers. After the siege, after the blinding, after the angels telling him the city will be destroyed, he hesitates. The angels have to grab him by the hand, his wife by the hand, his two daughters by the hand, and physically drag them out of the city. Genesis 19:16 adds 5 words that stop everything. The Lord being merciful to him, even now, even after all of this. Grace, pulling him by the hand out of the fire. The command is simple. Flee for your lives. Do not look back. Do not stop anywhere in the plain. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities and the entire plain, destroying all those living in the cities and also the vegetation in the land. The bitumen pits, the source of all that wealth, ignite instantly. Black smoke rises in columns visible from the mountains of Moab. The granaries that stored generations of surplus grain are incinerated. The irrigation channels boil dry. The date palms that lined the valley char into black columns standing like monuments to what was. Where a city stood, only a mound of superheated debris. Where thousands lived, nothing moves. But Lot's wife behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. She was out. She was safe. She had survived the night, the mob, the blindness, the verdict, and she looked back. One glance, one turn of the head. She was physically out of Sodom, but Sodom was not out of her. Modern science confirms that something catastrophic happened here. In 2021, a team of 21 scientists published a study in Nature Scientific Reports examining the destruction layer at Tal el Hammam. Pottery had been vitrified, heated so fast the clay fused into glass. Mud brick was melted. Temperatures exceeded 2,000 degrees Celsius. The soil was so contaminated with salt that the region remained uninhabitable for more than 600 years. The ancient text and the modern laboratory point to the same morning, the same valley, the same fire. Sodom had everything, and then Sodom had nothing. Abraham stood on the heights near Hebron early in the morning. Genesis 19:28. He looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah, toward all the land of the plain, and he saw dense smoke rising from the land like smoke from a furnace. The man who had argued for the city's life watched it burn in silence. Pride said, "I built this." Excess said, "I deserve more." Ease said, "I do not need to care." Neglect said, "They are not my problem." And sexual immorality said, "Nothing is sacred." 5 steps, 1 ladder. And by the time the city reached the bottom, there was nothing left for God to save. But here is the truth that should stop you where you sit. Ezekiel did not write chapter 16 to Sodom. Sodom was already ash. Sodom was buried under salt and silence. Sodom could not hear him. He wrote those words to Jerusalem, to a holy city, a religious people, a nation that had the temple standing in their streets, the Torah in their hands, and the covenant promise of God himself written over their history. These were people who went to worship, people who knew the scriptures, people who looked at Sodom and shook their heads and said, "We would never become that." And God held up the mirror and said, "You have become worse than the city you condemn." Not equal, worse, because Sodom never had the Torah. Sodom never had the temple. Sodom never had a prophet standing in the marketplace calling them to repentance. They sinned in ignorance. But Jerusalem sinned with full knowledge, and God said, "At least Sodom had an excuse. You do not." We look back across 4,000 years and point at Sodom as a warning of ancient judgment. We read the story and think, those people were monsters. We would never become that. We would never let our wealth make us blind. We would never ignore the poor. We would never cross the lines they crossed. But the Bible does not present Sodom as a story about them. The Bible presents Sodom as a mirror for us, for every generation that receives abundance and forgets where it came from. And the mirror is not kind. No heart becomes cold in a single day. It happens one step at a time. So quietly, you do not even notice. First, you take credit for your blessings. You work hard, yes. But somewhere along the way, you stopped thanking God and started thanking yourself. Then you consume more than you need. Not because you are hungry, because you are bored. Then you numb yourself with comfort. Screen after screen, distraction after distraction, anything to fill the silence so you never have to sit with your own conscience. Then you close your hands to those in pain. Not because you are cruel, because you are tired, because their problems feel heavy and your life already feels full, and then one day you look up and realize you have crossed lines you once swore you would never cross. And you do not even remember when it happened. That is the ladder. That is how it works. Not in one dramatic fall, in 1,000 tiny steps that each feel like nothing. The fire did not start from the sky on the morning Lot fled. The fire started inside the city gates, decades earlier, in the quiet, ordinary moments when the people of Sodom decided that their comfort mattered more than their conscience, their wealth mattered more than the poor, and their desires mattered more than God. The fire fell on Sodom. But the choice belongs to us. Which of the 5 did you recognize in yourself? Not in society. Not in the government. Not in the people you disagree with. In yourself. In your own house. In your own heart. Tell me in the comments. And tell me one thing you are going to do differently this week. Not a vague promise. Not something that sounds good but costs you nothing. A specific action. One real step back up the ladder. Because Sodom did not fall from one big decision. It fell from 1,000 small ones that no one thought mattered. And so do we. If you want to understand the full story of how God built a nation from Abraham's faith through the wilderness and into the promised land, we made a video that covers the entire Old Testament. We will leave the link for you. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. God bless you, and we will see you in the next one.